Continuing on talking about communities and trophic levels and the like, we said that some species within a community tend to have a larger impact than perhaps others, and that's because usually they are most highly abundant or they play some particular pivotal role within the community dynamics, and they don't necessarily have to be the largest, flashiest apex predator. For example, if you look at a marine trophic level community, you might consider, say, that killer whale as the most pivotal, largest impact creature within the environment. But you might find that in a food chain such as that it's the plankton, the phytoplankton, that play the most pivotal role, because if the phytoplankton aren't there, that food chain kind of grinds to a halt well before it gets to that killer whale. So sometimes it's not always the species that you expect, the ones that are most visible, that are the most impactful. It can be some of the smaller, lesser known creatures within that particular community. In some cases, we're going to be looking at what we call the dominant species, usually the ones that are most abundant or have the highest biomass overall. Dominant species tend to exert a pretty powerful control over that particular community. They kind of control the occurrence and distribution of other species within that community. The book talks about a good example being sugar maples. This type of tree has a major impact on the shading and the soil nutrient availability for any other tree in the area. So they have a great power over all the other trees because they are the dominant species. So they tend to be the most numerous, they tend to be the largest, and they tend to take up whatever reserves of soil nutrients, and they tend to shade the sunlight out from the other trees. So they tend to be the biggest, baddest guys on the block. How do you get to become the dominant species? Well, there's probably a variety of ways. One of those would be perhaps that you are the most competitive. You have certain advantages. You have certain evolutionary traits that allowed you to outcompete and exploit resources that others could not. Another hypothesis has to do with the ability to avoid predation. Maybe you're more successful at not getting killed off, more successful at avoiding the enemy. It's probably a combination of both of these for most creatures. Invasive species are actually another type of creature that sometimes can become the dominant species. An invasive species is one that is normally from another area. It's typically introduced to a new environment by humans, sometimes on purpose, which tends to then backfire on us, but sometimes it's accidental introduction, like for example, a lot of the island ecosystems that had no type of pig or dog or rat, well, those creatures were oftentimes introduced sort of accidentally, sort of on purpose by human explorers, and oftentimes, particularly those three species, pigs, dogs, rats, then became hugely invasive to that island ecosystem and wreaked havoc over the island inhabitants, the normal island inhabitants of the ecosystem there. Oftentimes they do this because when they're first introduced, these invasive species have no natural predators, or they're immune to any diseases within that new area. So because they haven't been there for a long time, and there hasn't been this ebb and flow and this homeostasis that occurs over time, suddenly it's like plopping them down in a new environment where they have everything they need, but they have nothing to keep them in check. And so you have that exponential population growth that we talked about previously in the other chapters, and these invasive species sometimes can even begin to wipe out all of the naturally occurring species in that area. Another good example of a species that might have a greater impact on a community is what we call a keystone species. A keystone species doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most abundant, the most dominant, for example, but they hold a particularly special job. Their role within that community is of particular importance. A good example is the field studies that the book mentions about this type of sea star and how it's a keystone species in the little intertidal pool community where it lives. So it may not be the most dominant species as far as numbers. There may not be more of them than anything else, but they did some experiments where they have various little tidal pools, and once again the scientists manipulate the population of various species, and they notice that without this particular little starfish, the number of other creatures, the number of other species drops. So for a variety of reasons, fairly complex ecological reasons, this guy is a keystone species, and him not being there has a negative effect on some of the other creatures. And what's interesting is when we study these trophic levels and these various food webs, it's easy for us to forget the interaction that occurs among among all these living creatures. So one good example in the textbook is the observation of sea otter populations and how that change in the number of sea otters has affected other creatures. What's happened is over the past 20 years, killer whales, orcas, have begun to prey more and more on sea otters. Sea otters are not their preferred diet, are not their preferred meal, but because there have been fewer and fewer seals, their preferred prey has diminished in number. They've had to start to go after their secondary choices, and so sea otters are like their secondary choice. They would prefer to eat seals for the most part, but as the seal population has declined for a variety of reasons, they have to find food wherever they can, so they start to go after the sea otters. Well, this has had kind of a ripple effect. So what's happened is the sea otter abundance has certainly dropped over time. So if you look at the number of sea otters over time, so here are your years down at the bottom, you can see that sea otter populations have declined as killer whales have begun to eat more and more of them. Well, here's what that means. Sea otters eat sea urchins, and so because there are fewer sea otters, the sea urchin population has grown over time. Well, sea urchins eat kelp, which is a type of aquatic plant, and so as the sea urchin population has grown, the kelp population has dropped dramatically. So you see all of this interplay where you see the rise in the population of one species, and that is going to indicate the fall of the population of another, and it goes back and forth. And so you see that it's very complex and it's all interactive, and this sea otter is kind of a keystone predator within this entire community that we're looking at. One last category of creatures that we might consider of special importance within a community are what we call ecosystem engineers or foundation species. And we call them ecosystem engineers because they physically change the environment they live in, and that can affect the community as a whole. That can affect other species. Probably the greatest example that you can think of, particularly here in North America, are beavers, because beavers and their activity where they create dams like you see here, they take a free-flowing stream and they may dam up that stream to create a pond, and that completely changes the entire ecosystem in that little area, which has a great effect on all the other living creatures there and all the plants, that entire community. So a beaver dam can transform the landscape in a pretty large scale way, and so you would consider them very important to that particular community. They are a foundation species or an engineering species, and they can do some fundamental changes with their activities. When you look at these trophic levels, there's actually two different ways of looking at it, and I don't know if one of these ways of looking at it is more correct than the other. I think you can use both of these methods when examining food chains and trophic levels, kind of depending on your purpose. One of those is called a bottom-up model, and a bottom-up model proposes kind of a unidirectional influence from the lower to the higher trophic levels. So what we're saying is the lower levels control the higher levels. So you might even say all the way down to like the nutrients of the soil, the presence or absence of minerals in the soil are going to determine the abundance of primary producers, which is then going to determine all the rest of the community structure all the way up to the top. So if you want to look at it this way, you start at the very bottom and you say the bottom controls everything above it. The opposite way to look at that would be a top-down model called a trophic cascade model, and this would be saying that no, it's those apex predators, those top carnivores or those top predators that control everything below. So you would say that the top predator eats the predator below it, which eats the herbivore, which affects the number of plants. So if you want to look at the top-down model, it might be like the way we were looking at the effect of killer whales on plankton, or I'm sorry, kelp. So if you go from top down, you can see how the killer whale's actions are indirectly affecting the kelp population. That would be a top-down idea. In this case, that's probably the best way to look at it. If you're looking at kelp and trying to figure out why has the amount and number of kelp dropped, you could start from the very top and you could figure out why. That the activity of the killer whale is ultimately causing this drop in population of the kelp. So that would be top-down. So there's two different ways of looking at it, bottom-up, top-down. I think both are beneficial, kind of depending on the situation and depending on what exactly you're studying. A good example your textbook uses of top-down control or manipulation is an example they use of biomanipulation. Biomanipulation is basically where humans come in and they change the environment, they change the community members to try to get a particular outcome. And they're talking about these lakes in Finland that have these blooms of cyanobacteria. So we sometimes see this, I know we see this here in East Texas sometimes, where you have, say, fertilizer runoff or something like that into a pond and you get an algae bloom. And that algae bloom reduces the amount of oxygen available in the water, because as that algae decomposes, it takes up the oxygen. Suddenly you have massive fish die off and you have a lot of fish floating dead to the surface. So they're talking about this in Finland, these blooms of cyanobacteria, and that happens because the zooplankton, the tiny little animal-like creatures that would eat the bacteria, were eaten by large populations of a fish called a roachfish. Well, the way they solved this was they added an additional consumer called a pike perch. He's a tertiary consumer. He's going to eat the roachfish. Well, what that means is there's fewer roachfish, which means there can be more zooplankton, which means they will reduce the number of cyanobacteria, and it will reduce the number of these blooms. So the way that they fixed the problem was a top-down approach. They introduced a larger apex predator to control a smaller predator, which then allowed for the proliferation to the growing number. How about that? The growing number of zooplankton, which then controlled what they wanted to control. So that's a good example of top-down control or manipulation. And again, you can look at it both ways, bottom up or top down. In this example, they're going top down. So here you have the fish, the zooplankton, the algae, and if you want to fix this, you could work potentially from the fish side to get the algae that you wanted. So in the polluted state, the fish were very abundant, which made the zooplankton rare, which made the algae abundant. When they introduced the larger fish, that made this fish rare, the zooplankton abundant, and that helped reduce the amount of algae, which is what they were after to begin with. We're going to stop right there, take another break. Our next concept is it says the disturbance influences species diversity and composition. We're going to talk about what happens to communities when major problems arise. That could be natural disasters, it could be disease, things of that nature, and then how do they recover from those. That's concept 54.3. We'll come right back.